So the shadow, which is a concept by Carl Jung, is very profound, something you may or may not have heard of. So I'm going to define what it means to start, and later I'll be talking about my own experience. So here is the definition. In Carl Jung's own words, the shadow is that hidden, repressed, for the most part inferior and guilt-laden personality whose ultimate ramifications reach back into the realm of our animal ancestors. So let me break this down. So it's an inferior and guilt-laden personality, and it reaches back to our animal ancestors. So I'm going to give you some examples here, right? So when we were hunter-gatherers and we were trying to hunt animals literally to feed ourselves, we were living in the wild. We were living very in touch with nature. And during this, obviously at night, we would have things like fear of snakes, right? We didn't want to get bitten by a snake and die from like snake poisoning, right? Or even maybe a stampede from a rhino. So that was a healthy example of fear. There's lots of healthy examples of fear. But nowadays, if you live in a city, you've still got this fear, you've still got this anxiety, you've still got this fight or flight state. But often it's unjustified. It's about nothing. We create situations in our head, right? So I see this all the time in the profession I work in of sales training, where you coach salespeople, and I've been through this myself, where you replay the worst possible case scenario. I'm going to call this person, I'm going to have a conversation with them. They're going to shout at me, they're going to reject me, the deal is not going to happen, I'm not going to get my commission. So this is an example of a shadow part. This is a fear part of yourself. This fear is not useful for you in this context if you're trying to be a salesperson. Even if you don't work in sales, you've got some type of business call and you suddenly get anxious about it. You're getting anxious about a situation that hasn't happened yet. And that fear is coming from your unconscious, right? You're unconsciously thinking about this. And that is an example of your shadow. And then Jung also says it can now be ascertained on closer investigation that the unconscious man, that is his shadow, does not consist only of morally reprehensible tendencies, but also displays a number of good qualities such as normal instincts, appropriate reactions, realistic insights, creative impulses. So obviously earlier I talked about fear in a negative context, but fear can be healthy. As I said, there's healthy level of fear, not just for our ancestors back in the day when they were hunter-gatherers worried about snakes. Nowadays, again, if you live in the city, maybe late at night, you're wary of the people that are around you in case they're going to rob you or be violent or anything like that. And again, that's healthy fear, right? That's fear of survival. But the fear I talked about earlier, where you're putting situations in your head, that's not good fear, right? So let's imagine worst case situation, someone attacked you in the middle of the night in the city. Either you run or your instinct is to fight. Both of those is that fight or flight state, but in an actual situation where your life may be in danger. So that's a good example of that unconscious fear, which is still coming from the shadow, the unconscious, but is that fear in a very healthy way. Anyway, so far it's been very academic talking about Jung's definition. So today's going to be an interesting episode because I'm going to be talking with a guy called Stephen D'Souza, who's actually an author, and he's got two really interesting TED Talks that I recommend watching. One is called The Wisdom of Not Knowing, and the other one is called The Paradox of Not Doing. So I'll put those in the show notes. I'm going to interview Stephen on a later episode. Actually, in this episode, what's interesting is he's going to interview me about my own journey with the shadow and how that relates to sales and some events that have happened in my life. It's a bit of an impromptu episode because actually he's interviewing me for a book that he's writing on the shadow. And when he interviewed me, I thought, oh, this is really actually interesting content we're talking about that I haven't discussed in detail on the show. So I want to publish it. So yeah, I hope you enjoy this episode. Let's get into it.
How did you start to think about the topic of shadow as it relates to sales and to your work?
Yeah, so I think so when you're first in sales, sales can be a very difficult job. I think it's got one of the highest churn rates, as in, so like if people have their first sales role, I think on average it's like 30 to 40% of them won't be in it the year after because they can't deal with the rejection and, you know, all the no's that you get. And I think there's probably even higher percentage in year 2, year 3, like leave. And I've even seen people that do very well in sales, but they still like the commission and stuff's not worth it. It's too stressful. And then you've got targets and you've got all this stuff. So sales is a very stressful job. And there's also like fear, right? It's like, oh, what if this person shouts at me? What if the customer's rude to me? And over time, it's like that, you know, serenity prayer. It's a variation of it, but for sales, which is that you have to realize you have absolutely no control over the buyer. The only thing you have control over is yourself, right? So then you start looking at yourself and your inner psychology, and you think, God, like you're really analyzing yourself and thinking, okay, like I have a lot of fear. I'm going to call this person. I have no idea how this person is going to react. That's like if it's a cold call, or even if it's like a deal you've already got in the pipeline, you're working on, say, some 6-figure deal, which I've, you know, closed those types of deals. And maybe the person hasn't got back to you for a week or 2 weeks, and you start putting things in your head like, oh, are they not interested anymore? Has something happened? So you're creating stories in your head and you actually have no idea what's happening. And you have to think, where is that coming from? It's coming from a place of fear. And then there's other things related to anxiety. There's pride involved in it as well, because I'm making myself look stupid. So you go through all these like emotions and sales. So at some point, I was like, I guess started to become more aware. And I thought, okay, I need to like start studying psychology because I need to understand my own psychology. I also need to understand the buyer's psychology as well, like why they're buying. Then I found Jung. I've always been someone that's like spiritual. So my mum, well, both my parents are actually Catholic, but my mum more so because she had an Irish dad, so I had an Irish grandfather. And I've kind of always believed there's some like uniting principle, God, whatever you want to call it. And then so Jung's idea of like the collective unconscious and, you know, the archetypes and all that stuff made sense. And especially the archetypes, actually, because then you get into storytelling. I was like, wow, these archetypes are brilliant because they're in all these different stories. And then also rock. So both from a practitioner standpoint, me selling, and then from a management training salespeople standpoint, I realized there's a lot of what I call like a victim mindset, and this relates to the shadow in sales, where salespeople are blaming external factors for them not hitting targets or being a good salesperson, like saying, oh, now, you know, now we're in 2024, oh, the economy's really bad, there's a recession, or my manager's really bad, or the product's really hard to sell. So blaming things outside of their self-person, looking at themselves and being like, how could I be better in this situation, right? Maybe let me listen back to my call. Like we're recording this, we recommend all sales calls should be recorded. So one, you can go back and listen, analyze yourself. 2, share calls with your teammates so they can listen, and maybe even your manager as well, and get feedback and constantly trying to improve. So understanding we all have a shadow, right? So maybe we did something that we shouldn't have done on a sales call. So yeah, I think we've all got a shadow, and the top salespeople recognize that and
What would be an
understand that and try to
example
deal with
of
it.
that, like a shadow playing out on a sales call?
Yeah, so I think the classic thing, so one of the emotions that really, I would say there's 2 sides of it, probably desire and greed connected to each other. So it's the desire of, I want to get this commission, and then maybe all kinds of things like you've got a son or daughter who you want to buy a certain thing for that you can't afford at the moment, or you want to send them to private school or whatever it is. And in your head, that's what you're thinking about when you go into the call. And because of that, when you get on the call, you lose that curiosity of who is this other person? What are they looking for? What are their problems? And how can I help them? And you're thinking, I need to get this deal across the line. And you start becoming that sleazy salesperson, and you start asking kind of like very awkward questions where you're like putting them into a corner, you know, and the buyer like goes on the defensive. So a classic example is like if someone brings up a competitor and you would start bad mouthing that competitor, oh, don't buy from them, they're rubbish because of X, Y, and Z. And buyers hate that. It's like really trashy. Where actually, if you flip it and you show curiosity, oh, you mentioned you're looking at a competitor. What are you looking at them for? Like, how is their product, etc. And then you can say, oh, by the way, this is some stuff we do that's different. but you're not trash talking them. That's really bad, right?
Mm.
So I think a lot of the time, salespeople, often this happens when money's involved, not just in sales. They become very desperate and they become very greedy, and that's why salespeople have a bad reputation.
It's really interesting. Look, if you were to think of like an archetype for a salesperson, what would that archetype be, Mikey? Guys, look, I was thinking of this myself, and I was thinking, look, I don't know the tarot symbolism very well, but like the merchant or the trader in modern language, would
Mm,
that be an archetype for if you were to relate, your profession to an archetype? And then what complexes do you think play out? So you talked about
mm.
complexes around. Have you given some reflection as you've been going through this course on, what complexes are playing out in sales and what complexes are playing out, what archetypes are playing out?
Yeah, so it's interesting actually because I'm working with this kind of YouTube storyteller consultant at the moment, and he's been getting me to think it's not archetypes, but like he's been getting me to go deeper on who are our ideal customers and what are we fighting against. So I know our ideal customers are like heads of sales, heads of marketing, CEOs, but he's been getting me to go layer deeper around like, okay, what's like the ideal salesperson that should be working for one of these people? And it's interesting because I feel like the sleazy salesperson, we may create this like figure out them, which we're calling like Jordan Cardone, because there's Jordan Belfort, who people may know from the Wolf of Wall Street film, right? He obviously was a con man, right? He conned people into like handing over loads of money, which they lost. And there's another guy called Grant Cardone, who's one of these like sales influencers in real estate, but he's again like selling snake oil essentially. So they're doing a lot of the things we hate and saying the opposite of what I said. Oh no, the seller is in control. You can manipulate the buyer into this and X, Y, and Z, right? So that's kind of what we're fighting against. But like with this course, there's always two sides of everything. And actually, that person, what they obviously don't have is a strong moral compass, but what they do have a lot of the time is they are very disciplined. They're just disciplined doing the wrong actions, right? But they are like putting in long days, they are working really hard. That's kind of the benefit of that old, Wolf of Wall
Mm.
Street type culture, right? Doing shitloads of calls and working really hard. So that's one side. And then on the other side, you've got a little bit more of like, we work with a lot of tech companies, is like the tech person who actually is quite intelligent. They've got like, good moral compass, etc. But they just don't want to work hard and they don't want to do the work. And I know if they did the work, they would be very successful. So it's like if you can take the moral compass, maybe the wrong way of saying it in sales, but essentially you really care for the other person. You really want to help them solve problems with the discipline. So that curiosity with the discipline, that's where you can take someone who's very elite, essentially.
I love
So yes,
the Jordan Cardone. What would be the opposite archetype of that then? Have you created like when you're helping others think of an archetype for an effective sales? Did you give it a character or how would you perceive
yeah.
that?
The thing I've been thinking of, so I kind of stole this from Jordan Peterson because he does a brilliant thing where he's analyzing the Lion King and then he compares it to like Carl Jung's archetypes. And he talks about when you watch Lion King, Simba when he's in Hakuna Matata with Timon and Pumbaa, everyone's like, oh yeah, he's living a great life, etc. But it's actually like pretty meaningless. He's basically run away from his responsibilities. He obviously thinks that he killed his dad. The audience know that he doesn't. So he's run away from that. He's run away from his land. And then Nala comes and she's like the anima and is saying, what the hell are you doing? You're like in this jungle, like eating bugs, and like we're all starving at home, and Scar's like destroyed the kingdom. So he is to go back home to like save the kingdom, right? So anyway, I've been giving that analogy of like you don't want to be like Simba, like avoiding the difficult stuff. In sales, you want
Mm.
to do the hard stuff. You want to do calls and maybe and push is not the right word, but it's like be persistent. We call it polite persistence, where you're
Mm.
following up in a meaningful way, not following up in, oh, did you see my proposal? Can you sign the check? But hey, when we last spoke, you mentioned X, Y, and Z. Like, how's that going? Right. So I think Mufasa, who eventually is like what Simba becomes, he becomes more of like his father, is that person who has like a deep sense of responsibility and is hardworking, but then also has like, really care. In his case, he really cares about his kingdom and his people. So that was like a movie archetype that we came up with.
Yeah, it's a lovely archetypal metaphor, and I don't know if it's true, but you can probably correct me on this. Like, I once heard a guy talk about the word "sail" from the Saxon, and it was, I think, "solde," which meant
Okay.
service. Did you know that? Is it true?
I didn't
Like,
know that, but that's brilliant. I love that.
yeah, so true sales is like an act of service. It was a guy called Roger Steer who wrote a book called Ethicability,
Okay.
and he talked about the root of the word in Old English, meaning service. So
I
yeah, I
love it.
just wondered if that was also a key part of your
Yeah,
ethos, really.
yeah, 100%. It's about serving your customers, right? It's not about
Mm,
serving yourself and your profits. And I always say the money will come at the end of it. If you live in capitalist society and you're making a
mm,
really good impact, and people are going to give you money, right? So
mm,
that's often, with what we do with sales is we don't say how much money have you got, what's your budget. We think that's terrible selling. Is we try to understand what the problem is at a very
mm,
deep level. Once we understand what the problem is, we present a solution. We say this is how much it costs, right? And the buyer can say yes or no, but we don't
mm.
put it on the buyer to say this is the value of the product. We say, hey, this is based on what you told me. This is what we charge. Like, is that like a crazy amount to you, or do you think this is feasible? Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, 100%. It's all about serving. And also a big thing in sales is saying no to deals, because this is also what happens. Salespeople will sell like sleazy deals, which are not a good fit for the customer or for the company. And then what ends up happening, not only is the customer being sold something that doesn't work for them, your customer support and operational team, they've got a terrible time. So they hate that salesperson because they can't deliver on what you've offered, right? So actually, like saying no is really important in sales as well.
Yeah, so I can see that. You're going for the quick win on your personal, but not really for anyone else. What
Exactly.
when we talked last, people often think, I'm not a salesperson. Why is sales relevant for the general reader when they're thinking about work?
Um,
How is it universally applicable? Why would anyone think about even sales as an
yeah.
important topic to read about or to even think about?
So this will maybe sound ridiculous to people that have never like worked in sales or had sales training, but we've coached. So I've had it at least two or three times. I know two trainers I work with have told me they've had it one or two times, right? We've had people that we've trained for a few months and they've said, I'm not grateful just because of like I'm closing more deals for my company. I'm grateful because I've actually got a better relationship now with my wife or husband because I've learned to be a better listener. I've learned to be curious. I've learned to be more present, right? I've learned like maybe what are some of the things that I'm doing wrong because we get very deep into the psychology. So sales for me is the art of communication. So if you become really good at sales, you become a much better communicator. And again, you go on this psychological journey where you're trying to understand yourself better. And if you understand yourself better, obviously you can serve others better as well. So I think sales, it helps you with storytelling, it helps you with listening, it helps you with asking better questions, helps you with psychology, as we're talking about today. Um, so yeah, I mean, yeah, it's just it's a really great skill for everyone to learn.
Like a fear of rejection, maybe can you recall like a specific incident where you encountered, you talked about this psychological journey where you encountered something that was in your shadow, that was hidden, but then
Mm.
suddenly it clicked, it was revealed, and you could work with it and become better at sales or better at serving the customer. Is there something specific that you held as a belief or as a projection or something that was influencing your sales work? And what was
Yeah,
that specific incident that was a breakthrough insight for you?
yeah. So I've got um, what are they called? A complex, which is with Tash, I've labeled Jeff the people pleaser. And Jeff the people pleaser still exists. And one of the things I've learned on this course is you have to kind of make friends with your complexes and learn when to use them in the right way, but
Mm,
not in certain situations. And obviously, people pleasing is not it can be a good skill of like building rapport, connecting with people, maybe on like an emotional level, like fun level, right? But then
Mm,
actually to get stuff done, often you have to challenge customers, and this is there's actually a whole like sales methodology called challenger sales. So
mm,
anyway, when I was first in sales, I was, and this is why I have a lot of empathy for salespeople we train now. I didn't want to call anyone, right? I would just like send emails because that was the easy thing to do. You know, even if someone rejects your email, they're just going to press unsubscribe or whatever, and that's it. Whereas if they get angry on the phone, you're going to hear it, or in person, you're going to feel it, right? So I always just wanted to do the easy thing to like email people, etc. And then actually, a guy who I ended up hiring, this guy called Lawrence Chapman, he's an older guy in his 50s. I just saw he would just like call people, you know, all the time, like make cold calls. He'd have absolutely no fear. And I was like, how
mm,
do you do it? And he said, look, if they shout at me, I have absolutely no control over that. That's them, right? And then I thought,
mm,
oh, this is cool. And then I started doing a lot of the things he was doing, and I started seeing it a little bit more of a game. And
mm,
in a past life, I wanted to be a professional tennis player. So up until the age of 14, I was like representing the UK, traveling around the country playing tennis. And it's interesting because tennis is an individual sport, and there is like very lonely, a lot of psychology and stuff. When you lose, you feel really down and all this stuff. And I thought, oh, sales is actually like tennis. I don't need to beat anyone else. I just need to beat myself, right? I need to try and be better than I was yesterday, improve, you know, there's that cheesy quote, get 1% better each day. So anyway, I started to see sales more like a game, and I had less of this. The other thing we talk about a lot is detachment, which is almost like a, you know, Buddhist type thing of detach yourself from the outcome, because the more obsessed you are, I need, you know, my company's given me $1 million quota this year that I need to hit, and I'm only at 300,000, and you know, we're in October, how am I going to get this other? The more you obsess about that, the more actually you're not going to hit your target. You're going to be the sleazy salesperson versus thinking, okay, who are the people I'm selling to? What are their problems? How can I help them? That's really what's going to make you an elite seller, right? And then yeah, doing the difficult things, sometimes calling people and being comfortable. Maybe they're in the middle of something and they're going to hang up the phone, or they're going to get angry, or whatever it is. Or maybe I'm going to spend 6 months with a customer because it's a big enterprise deal worth millions, and they're still going to reject me, and that's just life, right? So getting comfortable with that. So yeah, that was definitely the people pleasing. So I felt like I managed to get rid of Jeff in sales, but I still have Jeff in loads of other areas of my life. So when I started my own business, I wasn't attached to like sales, but I was attached sometimes to the opinions that my staff would have of me, right? So I had to work on those types of things as well. So people pleasing has affected me in a lot of areas of my life, but I think I managed to deal with it quite well in sales.
yeah. So you became aware of that complex when you were maybe trying to be too pleasing with the, or avoiding necessary conflict with the customer.
Exactly.
And just you mentioned, and I came to know your podcast and your YouTube channel, Cosmic Bridge. Could you say a few words about what made you start a YouTube and that podcast, what your intention was? And then you did a really interesting interview with a psychiatrist from the US that works on with death row prisoners, and you've been writing letters to
Yeah.
and can you say a few words about that, and any way that you can make a bridge of that to your work in your company and in your work in sales? I know that's a big jump,
Yeah.
but have you thought about why you're doing that and any link to your work as a professional in sales?
Yeah, no, it's not a big jump. So we have a sales framework called Cosmic, and this relates to the theme of the show. Theme of Cosmic Bridges: how can we balance the spiritual and the material, which is something Jung talks about a lot. You can use many different terms here. He may talk around, you know, the logical, the rational, right, the conscious, and then like the unconscious of more of what I call the spiritual, but it could be more of like the emotional, right? So in sales, this is really important because again, people don't trust salespeople because they say things like, we're going to 10 times your revenue, we're going to 10 times your amount of leads, right? We're going to 10 times your ROI. And it's like, I don't know you, I don't trust what you're saying. And this is what loads of sales trainers will say. So maybe eventually you can come to that point where you can make a business case where you're like, we think we may be able to do this, but first you've got to try and connect with them on some type of emotional level. And you know, we give examples like if you're selling to a marketing team, often marketing get very upset because sales say, oh, you just make fluffy PowerPoints and you're doing like useless stuff, right? So that's like connecting with that marketer on an emotional level. And like, we're going to help you be respected by the sales team because we're going to help you with X, Y, and Z. So we talk a lot about that. And that's actually one of our probably like differentiators, because most sales trainers don't say that stuff. So it's like, how can we connect at a deep emotional level with our buyers? And then the cosmic bridge is, yeah, how the podcast is around how can we have that balance. And I always say, let's say you may be someone that goes to church or a mosque or sees a rabbi, every Sunday, but then the reality is then in your life nothing changes. Even though you've got this spiritual experience, you're religious, nothing changes in your life, right? So for us, that's how can you take the spiritual experience, right, whether that's through praying, religion, meditation, whatever it is, and turn it into something material and tangible. And when I say material, it's not always it's not money, right? It's just material as in like something we can see that's tangible. And then on the other end, you obviously got a bad balance, which is some people have an absolute ton of money, but they've got no faith in God and nothing, and their life is meaningless, and they're very like nihilistic, right? Or they're like very greedy and they've got a load of money, but they've got absolutely no friends. So they're lacking the spiritual, right? So it's about how can we can balance these two things. That's what the podcast is about. And then we've had, wide variety of we've had a few different religious leaders. We've had like meditation experts. I've had people like in business, entrepreneurs, sales leaders, but they're talking more around, things in the background, religion, spirituality, breathing, etc. And then one of the most interesting ones we had was, so maybe I can give the background of how I ended up interviewing this guy who's a psychiatrist of people on death row. I basically read a story about this guy who was an Ethiopian political prisoner, and he did this same thing where he wrote to people on death row, and he was comparing his experience to someone on death row in America. And he said, sadly, the person died, and he'd exchanged 20 letters, and he actually like grieved. It was a weird situation where he'd never met the guy. And then because I believe in Jung's synchronicity, I then saw an advert like 4 days later in a magazine I was reading, and I thought, God, this is a sign. I need to at least look into this. So I went to the website, etc. And then, within a few months, I was writing to someone on death row. And I won't tell you the name of the person, but I know they told me when I started that I should not look up the crime that the person had done, because I could just Google the name, because they said you're going to judge that person, right, from that. And they said maybe after a few months, once you exchange letters, do that. So I really like that advice, because after a few months, I did Google what he'd done, and it turned out he'd shot a cop, right, in Florida, and that cop had died essentially. But what I realized through his story is he got married very young. He had like 3 kids when he was very young. He had a gambling addiction. So I've never actually talked to him about what happened, but I connected the dots and was like, okay, he was obviously trying to get money to like feed his family, etc. And then going to what we're talking about is obviously the whole premise of the podcast. Even though I empathize with it, and that's why I write to someone on death row, I said to the guy who's a psychiatrist, I was like, how can you do this job? How can you be a psychiatrist for people on death row? And then he got very Jungian, and he said, if you really believe in the collective unconscious of God, you have to see yourself in every single person. So that serial killer, maybe if I'd had the exact same life as that person, I would have been like him. And that was a very crazy thing for him to say, because so how I got him to speak on my podcast, there's an annual conference where all the people that write to those on death row gather once a year in London. And he was actually speaking at the event. And he basically told this story of a guy who was went into a Walmart in the US and I think he shot like 20 or 25 people, and maybe 15 people of them died. And they were basically all Mexican Californians. This was in El Paso. So they were people that were like him. So I was like, how can you defend someone who's basically shot people exactly like you? And he just said, like, these people are very mentally ill. I'm not saying they should be released from prison because they deserve to do time for their crime, but they literally have no one, and I have to see myself in them. And that's the thing with sales, right? So to take this back is, if a customer's rude to me, or if something's happening, I have to try and empathize with their situation. That one, maybe it's on me, I could have been doing something better. Or two, and this happens all the time, is maybe that person is struggling with something in their life in that moment. And I've had this where I call that person 2 weeks later and they're a completely different person, because, at that time their dog had died, or a relative had died, or something really bad had happened in their life. So yeah, I think it's that that level of empathy that that person has, and seeing your shadow in the other person is deep. So that was a very long-winded answer there, but
Feel that it's given you more empathy? Have you noticed yourself change in the letter writing process over there? I think you've been writing that 18 months, is that right?
yeah, definitely. I mean, so I think it's given me a lot of gratitude. So like, you know, this person's obviously living in four walls. He can go out, I think, like a couple of hours a day, like into like the yard to do exercises. Um, and obviously I'm, I can say what's new, and he's like, nothing is new, right? He makes a laugh about it. And sometimes I'm having a bad day, and just even contemplating that, I think, God, I have so much freedom, so much fortune in my life. So yeah, I think it's given me like an immense amount of gratitude. That's been like one of the really big things. And then also just seeing like he's obviously committed a terrible crime, but he's like a pretty, like the way he writes, he's a pretty normal guy. He's obviously quite wise because he's had a lot of time to think. He's been in there for like 20 years. Um, yeah, it's been a great experience.
Mm. Can you name the charity that you work with?
Yeah, it's called Human Rights, and then rights is spelled WRITES.
Mm. No, that's brilliant. There's obviously like to me it speaks also of connecting and rapport, and
Yeah,
being able to connect deeply, and that equally facilitates you being a great salesperson as well.
yeah. And I feel
So,
like, yeah, and I don't want to get too political on this, but I feel like I felt a little bit, I'd be interested to hear your opinion,
mm,
offline outside the book, but I felt a little bit, um, what's the word I'm looking for? Like isolated from like mainstream politics and social media and all these things. Cause I feel like everything is so polarized. That's one of the reasons I started the podcast. It wasn't just about spiritual material, but like connecting people, like you said. And I
mm,
feel like the left and the right, in inverted commas, they both project onto the other side, right? So like obviously more, I hate the term, but the woke will be, complaining about Trump or whoever it is, right? And then Trump does the same thing. He's complaining fake news on everyone. And I just feel like I wish people would just have conversations with each other, because I actually think we've got so much more in common than we realize. And yeah, I would see myself as more of like a centrist politically, and
mm,
I'm happy literally to speak with like anyone, right? I'm not like a huge podcast, but I would sit down with Biden, I would sit down with Trump, I would sit down with
mm,
like Netanyahu or a Palestinian or whoever it is, right? And you have to like get both perspectives. And I think people have people have like forgotten about that, and I think it's really important that we try and connect the dots.
have you read Jonathan Haidt, The
No.
Righteous Mind? You might like that. And yeah, he was very left, and then on left wing, and couldn't understand the right. And then he went through a whole process of looking at why he can't. And then he came to the simple thing about breaking bread, having a meal together with somebody that disagreed.
Mm,
But he's a really good psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, I think it is, Haidt. And the book is The Righteous Mind. But he'd written a few books but about this topic of bridging the divide. I think it's fascinating. Michael, thank you. Is there anything else you want to say about sales? Because the whole profession is changing, where you are,
mm,
almost like introducing the personal element with people calling, but you did mention the spamming and LinkedIn and multiple emails. Have you
yeah.
got any thoughts on the shadow of sales or the psychology of the shadow of, as sales is evolving and becoming less personal, maybe more personal, actually, more personalized, but at the same time, less personal. It's becoming much more know your specific needs and wants that because of all the data it can collect, but in the same
Yeah,
time, it's less personal. Do you know what I mean? There's like a
definitely.
paradox there, but what's your reflection on the future of sales and the
Yeah.
shadow?
100%. Yeah. So obviously AI is like a big thing people are talking about now, but I think a lot of salespeople use technology actually not because they think it's going to make their job easier, but so they don't have to talk with a human. And our thing is always like making the sales experience as human as possible. But I think going to the shadow is there's always a fear because when you're interacting with the screen doesn't shout at you or do anything, right? Whereas when you're with a human, humans are very complex people, and we have these crazy emotions, like, you know, Jung and any psychologist would talk about. So there's always that risk that, you know, a human is going to get angry or upset or shouty or whatever it is. And I think because of that, and this isn't just sales, you're seeing that more and more with technology, like we've lost those like human interactions. So we train people, like, try and double down on like doing the scary things where maybe you turn up at someone's office, or you do cold call them, or you send them a gift in the post, or you like be a little bit bold, and maybe they will be freaked out and it's not relevant. But, and we don't say like just do generic stuff. We say reach out with purpose, do your research on the person, and then do that. But yeah, it's like really like going like into the uncomfortable stuff. And a lot of sales and marketing is interrelated. So even like people that are like posting on social media now, there's this whole thing of like social selling. They're getting leads for themselves as salespeople that they're then able to close. And loads of people are starting businesses off the bat. That's how I started my business. But that takes a level of vulnerability, because a lot of people they don't want to post on social media because they're like, oh yeah, what if no one likes my content, right? And so there's that fear that's involved as well. So like anything that you're scared of in sales, that may actually be a sign that that's something you should go into.
Let's end on that note. That's a powerful phrase to end. Thanks, Michael.
Right, so that was Stephen interviewing me about the shadow. The shadow may be a new concept for you who are not familiar with Carl Jung. I'm always happy to talk about this. If you want to leave a comment underneath or reach out to me directly, I'll be happy to talk about my own experience with the shadow. And I will see you all next week on the next episode. Cheers.